So hello everyone and welcome to the Brainwave Chess Club. Today we are going to see a game played between international master Nubair Shah Shaikh and grandmaster Bela Khotenashvili. So this game was played in 2015 which lasted for around 100 moves. And the important thing about this game is that there were no mistakes in this game from both the sides. Yes, you have heard it right, that there were no mistakes in this game from both the sides. Obviously there were slightly inaccuracies in the game, but there were no mistakes in this game from both the sides. So I hope you will enjoy this video. Also make sure to hit the subscribe button, and now let's get started with the game. So here Nubair Shah had the white pieces and he started the game with the move 1 d4, knight f6 by black, c4, g6, knight to c3 and now d5. So black goes for the Grunfeld defense, bishop to f4, bishop to g7, e3 and now c5. And now here the main move is to play d into c5, which was played in the game. So black plays here queen to a5. And now in this position usually white responds with rook to c1, but Nubair decided here to exchange the queens and he played queen to a4. So queen into a4, knight into a4 and now bishop to d7. So also developing the bishop and attacking the knight at the same time. So white comes back with knight to c3. And now black played a knight to e5, sacrificing the d5 pawn, so white accepts it and he played knight into d5. And now the threat is knight to c7 check and pick up the rook. So black plays a knight to a6, guarding the c7 square, f3 by white, kicking the knight, so knight into c5 by black. And now white castles, e6 by black, kicking the knight, so knight comes back to the c3 square. And now black played a bishop into c3, and after b into c3 you can see that white has these shattered pawns, but even though this position is completely equal and playable from both the sides. So black continued with f6. So here white replied with g4, black castles, knight to a3 by white, e5, bishop comes back to the g3 square, bishop to f6 attacking the f3 pawn, so bishop to e2 by white defending the f3 pawn, e4, rook to f1, e into f3, bishop into f3, rook into f3, rook into f3, and now rook into d1, king into d1, rook to d8, king to c2. And now you can see that after so many exchanges this position is completely equal and drawish. So here black continued with knight to e4, knight to c2 by white, knight to c5, knight into e4, knight into e4, and now comes the move rook to f4. And now you cannot move the knight because the pawn on f6 will be hanging. So black played here rook to e8, king to d3 by black, knight to c5 check, king to e2, and now rook to e6 because the pawn on f6 will be hanging. And now comes the move g5, and now you cannot capture this pawn because simply rook to f7, and now there are two threats and you cannot defend both of this at the same time. So after the move g5, black played here knight to e4. So white played here g into f6, knight into f6 by black, bishop to h4 attacking the knight, so the knight goes back to the d7 square, rook to f7 by white, rook to a6, and now white has to be very careful. White cannot play a move like rook to h7 because here comes simply rook to a2, and after king to f3 here comes knight to e5 check, and after king to e4 here comes knight to c4. So that's why in the game after rook to a6, white played here bishop to g3, which was best move in this position, and after rook to a2, king to f3, a5, c5 by white, rook to a1, rook into h7, rook to f1 check and king to e2, and rook to f6. And it was very important for black to bring the rook in this file because rook to a8 check was coming. So white played a rook to a8 check, and now black has this option to play rook to f8 because he brought his rook to the f file, which was very important. And the game continued with rook to h4. White denies the exchange of the rooks, rook to f6 by black, rook to a4, rook to a6, bishop to d6, knight to f6, king to d3 and king to d7. So both the players start to bring their pieces and the king into the game. So here white continued with bishop to e5 attacking the knight, so black goes for knight to d5, e4 attacking the knight, knight goes back to the d7 square, rook to a1, knight to c6 attacking the bishop, so bishop comes back to the d4 square, a4 pushing the pawn, rook to a3 not allowing the pawn to be get pushed further, king to e6, king to c7, so bringing the king into the game, rook to a8, king to b3, and now knight to e5. And now the threat is to play knight to c4 check and pick the rook, so rook comes back to the a1 square, knight to c4 check, king to a2, knight to d2 attacking the e4 pawn, so rook to a1 defending the e4 pawn, and now black pushes the pawn further to the a3 square, rook to e2 attacking the knight, so the knight comes back to the c4 square, rook to f2 threatening rook f6 check and picking up the g6 pawn, so the king goes back to the e7 square, and now rook to f1, rook to a6, and now rook to b1 attacking this b7 pawn. So black plays here knight to b2 blocking the b file, but now comes c4, and now you can see that the knight is under attack. So black has to play a knight into c4, but now comes rook to b7 check, and after king to d8 white plays here rook to b4 attacking the knight, knight to d2, bishop to e3 again attacking the knight, knight to f3 attacking this h2 pawn, so bishop to f4 defending the h2 pawn, but now comes g5 attacking the bishop, so bishop goes back to the g3 square, and now king to d7, but now comes the move rook to b3, and now you can see that the knight is under attack and also this a3 pawn. So black defends the knight with the move g4, but now he loses this a3 pawn, and here exchanging the rook obviously favors white, so black plays here rook to h6 attacking this h2 pawn. So white continued the game with rook to a7 check, king to c8, and now rook to g7 attacking this g4 pawn. So black played here knight into h2, and now white cannot play here bishop into h2 because rook into h2 will come with a check. So white played here bishop to f4, a very good move because now rook to h6 check does not work because the king will simply go to b3, c4 and d5, which will be a winning position for white. So black played here rook to f6 attacking this bishop, but now comes bishop into h2, rook to f2 check, king to b3, and after rook into h2 here comes rook into b4, and now if you look at this position is completely winning for white, and it's just a matter of technique to win. So black played here king to c7, king to c4 by white, rook to c2 check, king to d4, rook to d2 check, king to c3, and now rook to d1, and now white played here rook to g6 cutting off the king, rook to c1 check, king to d4, rook to d1 check, and now king to e5. So here you can see that white is slowly and steadily improving his position. So black played here rook to c1 attacking the pawn, c6 by white, rook to e1, rook to h6, rook to c1 again, rook to e6 making some room for the king, so rook to f1 by black cutting off the king, rook to f6 by black, rook to e1, rook to f5, rook to f1 check again, king to g6, rook to g1 check, and now king to f7. And now you can see that this e4 pawn is ready to be pushed further, so black attacks it with rook to e1, rook to e6 defending, rook to f1 check, king to e7, rook to f4 again attacking, e5, rook to f5, and now king to e8, rook to h5, king to f7, rook to h7 check, king to g6, rook to h1, and now rook to f6. So black again attacks the pawn with rook to e1, but now comes the move e6, and now this e6 pawn is unstoppable, and this is a completely winning position for white, but black tries a couple of few moves over here and plays king to c6, but now comes king to f7, king to e6, and now rook to f2, and now black cannot capture this e6 pawn because there is rook to d2 check. So black plays here rook to e3, but now comes rook to d2 check, king to c7, and now e7. And now this e7 pawn is just one step away to be queen, so black just tries to give some checks, rook to f3 check, king to e8, rook to f1, rook to d7 check, king to c8, rook to d4, and after king to c7 here comes rook to c4, king to b7, and after king to d7 it was in this position that black resigned, because here you cannot give just some checks, because let's say if you play a move like rook to d1, here comes simply king to e6, and after rook to e1 check here comes king to d6, and after rook to d1 check here comes the final move king to e5. And now you cannot play a move like rook to e1 check because here comes the move rook to e4, and after rook into e4, rook into e4, you can see that this e7 pawn is unstoppable. So thanks for watching guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. Also make sure to hit the like button, we will be coming up with more amazing and interesting videos like this.